The gospel for today is on page 1206 in the Bible, page 1206. It's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, beginning with verse 21, page 1206. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. This gospel kind of demands that you remember last week's gospel. I'm sure you all remember that, right? We do a little test now, okay? The gospel last week was Jesus coming back to Nazareth, his hometown, and this was kind of his first public statement. He reads from the book of the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue, and he says, he doesn't say it, but the idea is, this is my mission statement, that we take care of the poor, and we have a Jubilee year. Now, we'll talk more about what that means. When he finished, he said to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at his gracious words that came from his mouth. Then they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote me the proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did in Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard all this about all those pagans being cured, and not them, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through their midst and went on his way. The Gospel of the Lord. The scriptures today speak a lot about rejection. Jeremiah was rejected by all the powers that be and by the people themselves. Jesus was rejected. Let me tell you some stories about rejection. I think that we prepare our kids for success. We probably all ought to also prepare them for rejection and for failure. The lady that wrote the Harry Potter series was rejected by 12 different publishers before her work was accepted. One of them even told her, "I wouldn't quit your day job." Elvis Presley was fired by the manager of the Grand Ole Opry, who told Elvis, "You ain't going nowhere, son. You ought to go back to driving a truck." And Stephen King, his first novel was rejected 30 times before it was published. Carrie went on to become a great musical hit, as well as 4 movies came from it. So those who can stand rejection hopefully will also see success from time to time. In today's gospel, Jesus first finds success and then failure, because when he read that from the prophet Isaiah and said that this is the mission statement that I intend to operate from, the last phrase of that said that I come to establish a year of favor from the Lord, which is a code phrase for the Jubilee year. Now, you recall that the Jubilee year meant that slaves were freed, debts were forgiven, and you went back to your promised land, to your heritage, the land that you started out from. When you came from Egypt, 40 years to the desert, you arrived in the promised land. The land was divided up. by tribes and then families, and that was your land. So every 50 years, which is when a jubilee was supposed to happen, you would go back to your promised land and start all over again. Now that sounded great to the poor, because especially those who had suffered illness and couldn't work, or perhaps they were disabled in some way, and they had to sell off their land. Their wealth was in their land, not in money, but in their land. And so they had to sell off parts of their land, and sometimes all of their land, and sometimes they even had to sell family members into slavery. And so now they go back and can start all over again. And they thought, wow, that's wonderful. And they sang his praises. And then I suspect what happens is the rich said, wait a minute. He's talking to us too? We have to get rid of everything we have and go back to our promised land and to our heritage and start over again after we've built up all this wealth? No, I don't think so. And we haven't done this for 400 years. We're supposed to do it every 50 years, but we have not done it for 400 years because the rich always said, no, let's don't do that this year. Let's just put that off. And so the poor got poorer, the rich got richer, and Jesus is out to upset all that. And so I think, it doesn't say this exactly in the scripture, but I think they said, wait a minute. And they talked to the poor and they said, you remember Jesus. He grew up here in Nazareth. You remember him as a little kid running around town in a droopy diaper. How can you think anything special is coming from him? He's just like you. He's nothing great. And they eventually turned people against him, and so they were so enraged, they took him to the brow of the hill and were about to throw him off the cliff when he walked through them. But Jesus was rejected from the beginning, and he's rejected on the cross, and rejection followed him throughout his life. There were good times too, but lots of rejection. That's kind of like what we have to face sometimes. Let me tell you about Corrie ten Boom. Anybody remember Corrie ten Boom? She was born in Amsterdam in Holland. And in 1940, the Nazis came and overtook the land. They invaded. And they began their work of exterminating the Jews. They took all the Jews out to have them killed, or to kill them themselves. In 1942, a Jewish woman came with a suitcase to their house. And she said, my husband has been taken. I'll probably never see him again. And I think they're coming after me. Can I stay at your place? Can I hide here? And Corrie's father said, sure, come on in. And that was the beginning of many Jewish people who hid out in their home. In fact, she got ration cards for many of the Jews under false names. And finally, she was betrayed by someone, and they came and arrested her and took her family off to concentration camps. Ended up at Ravensbrück, where her father died. Her sister starved to death. Carrie was released by a clerical error somehow, and she lived till 92, I think it was. And she told her story. But she suffered rejection because she was doing something that was loving those who were oppressed, the Jews. Now, I think we Christians are supposed to live that way. I'm sure lots of people in her days knew what she was doing and said, I don't want to get involved. Leave me out of this. Others probably supported her but were quiet. Some were members of the resistance and joined with her. And some thought she was doing the work of the devil, probably. That's how people think about folks who are taking a stand and trying to do what is right to save the oppressed. And so I think the question for us is, when Jesus says love one another, who's he talking about? Who are the other? Unfortunately, or fortunately, other are everyone. So, and as I said a while ago, sometimes it's hard enough to love those who are dearest to us. But what about those who are very different from ourselves? So let's just take a few moments to think about, how loving am I to people who are different, people I don't even agree with, refugees, migrants, people at our border, the homeless, the super poor, LGBT people, all the people that are so different from us. How do we really love them?